Ironically, I was planning on doing a different message, and I changed my mind last Saturday. I'm like, oh, I'm going to do this other message. I really don't feel like the other one's going anywhere. And so I started writing this message, and I took a break, and I turned on the TV, and Trump had bombed Iran. And I'm thinking, wow, this is pretty timely. And then, obviously, a few days later, they made peace, and I'm thinking, wow, maybe this isn't timely. But come on, that's a joke. But one of the things, like, I see a lot of Christian posts on Facebook. And sometimes some of the posts on Facebook, I'm like, I look at them and I'm just like, wow, that's not good. You know, like, they really missed it. And so today I'm going to talk about one of the posts I saw on Facebook. And it's a quote from Luke 21:20. And it says this: "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near." And do we have that picture? Maybe not. Yeah. So this is it, right? When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you will know the desolation. Basically what they're saying is what we're seeing right now is end times unfolding. That's what they're getting at. And it's a reference to Revelation 16, verses 14 and 16. And in Revelation it says this: "These are demonic spirits that perform signs and go out to all the kings of the earth to assemble them for battle on the great day of God the Almighty. And they assemble the kings in the place that the Hebrews is called Armageddon," right? So they see that this verse in Luke is related to this event in Revelation called the Battle of Armageddon. What they're basically implying is that what we're witnessing right now in Israel is the beginning of a final end times battle. So today I want to take a little bit deeper look into Luke 21 and really hopefully kind of see what's going on there. But before we do that, I want to start with some background information. One of the keys to reading Scripture is understanding. There's a lot to understand when you read Scripture, and in particular, background information is really important because if you think about it, when the writers of the biblical books are writing, they're writing to a specific group of people, and they're writing to a specific circumstance and a specific place and time, and ultimately, we're not any of those. And so context becomes super important for us. And one of my biggest pet peeves is when people take verses out of context, like this one. So while the Bible is certainly a unique book, right? It's the only book written by God. It also has human authors, and these human authors leave distinctive marks on it as well. And a couple of things to understand. Like all literature, individual books of the Bible were written to be read from beginning to end. They didn't expect you to jump around, right? They expected the reader to read large portions at a time. How many other books have you guys ever read where you jump around from sentence here and maybe then go to 2 pages later and go to another sentence and then maybe go to the end of the book and then read another sentence? How many of you have ever read a book like that? Never. But yet we do that with the Bible. I got my Diet Mountain Dew. My mouth gets really dry up here. Anyway, I actually had one of my professors in seminary, and he used to say it, and I love this quote, that the smallest unit of meaning in a text is a paragraph. In other words, if you read anything smaller than a paragraph, you're probably doing it wrong. And the issue is that when you read one sentence by itself, it's usually not big enough to convey the thought the author's trying to get across. So when you read just 1 or 2 verses, you're essentially divorcing that text from its context, from everything that gives it meaning around it. And you run the risk of misinterpreting it in terrible ways. Just a couple interesting facts, so to kind of validate my point here. Do you realize that the Bible didn't have chapters until a guy named Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, added them in around 1230 AD? So believe it or not, there was no chapters in the Bible until 1230 AD. In fact, the first Bible to have chapters in it was the Wycliffe Bible in 1382. Before that, it was literally just one long run-on sentence. On top of that, verses don't get added until 1550 AD when a scholar named Stephanius added them to his third edition of the Greek text called the Textus Receptus. Someday I want to do a sermon on the Textus Receptus because it's actually the Greek version that's used for the translation of the King James. But that's a whole other topic. Anyway, but so no Bible prior to 500 years ago had verses even in them. Think about that. For the first 1,500 years of Christianity, they didn't have verses. How would that change how you read your Bible? Exactly, right? So why is this relevant? Hopefully this helps drive the point home that the Bible wasn't intended to be picked apart like we kind of do today, right? They were added to help people find things quickly, but they don't necessarily divide the author's thoughts well, right? It was meant to be a tool to help us, but in some ways it's kind of actually hurt us, right? So context is super important, guys, when we're reading a text. And when you take one verse out of context, you can literally make it say anything like, the end of the world is here, right? Just like Homer said. So the next thing I want to talk to you guys about is unique to the Gospels. And that's this, that we have 4 Gospels. They're written by 4 different authors, and they're really describing the same thing, the life of Jesus. All right? That would be like having 4 different authors write a biography about any one of us. Would they all contain the same information? Would they all have the same details? Right? So many times the authors describe the same event, but each one tailors it to their particular audience. Right? So when we read the Gospels, we have to understand that each one is tailoring it to a specific audience. Luke is a Gentile, all right? So he's not a Jew, he's a Gentile. He's a highly educated scholar. In fact, he's a doctor. That's why he's the only gospel writer that doesn't talk bad about physicians. Come on, that's funny. Like, literally, like, everybody else doesn't have a good opinion of doctors except the doctor, right? But Matthew, on the opposite, he's a Jew, and he's writing to a Jewish audience. So Matthew's going to tailor his audience to Jews. And so what you're going to see in, say, Luke is probably not a huge dependence on Old Testament. Because if you're speaking to people that don't know the Old Testament, why would you reference it? But on the opposite, if you're speaking to Jews who grew up in the traditions of the temple and in the traditions of Judaism, you would certainly appeal to the Old Testament to validate your points. So what I'm trying to get at is that the authors are going to tailor their stories to their audience, right? Let me see. I kind of jumped ahead here. Anyway, so we're going to take a look at Luke today, and because he parallels with other authors, we're going to jump into Matthew a little bit and maybe Mark a little bit, depending upon how much time we have. But I want to kind of focus on Luke. And it starts in Luke 21:5. And what we see here are the disciples. They're in Jerusalem. This is the last week of Jesus' life. He is on the verge of going to the cross. And the disciples, I can only imagine, are oblivious to this fact. Like, they're just like, hey, we're in Jerusalem, cool. But they're looking at the temple, and they're amazed at what they see, right? And so I don't actually have that verse in here, but anyway, So they're looking at the temple, and they ask Jesus, they're like, look at this amazing temple. And Jesus looks back at him, he goes, yeah, what you see here, there's coming a day when it's not going to be standing anymore, right? That this building, this temple is going to be destroyed, and not even 2 bricks will be on top of each other. What Jesus is talking about is an event that happens in 70 AD. So the beginning of Luke is a conversation between Jesus and his disciples about a future event, and that is the destruction of the temple in 70 AD by the Romans, in particular a general named Titus, who would eventually become emperor. So that brings up a question too then. So Jesus is prophesying about a future event that's roughly 30 years down the road. Believe it or not, people who do not believe the Gospels are divinely inspired have an issue with this portion of Scripture, right? Luke 21, Matthew 24, and I think it's like Mark 12 or 13. But anyway, they're going to argue that these books were actually written after 70 AD, and that's why they describe the destruction of the temple, because they were written after the fact, right? But I want to argue for the point that these actually are written before that. Believe it or not, these books were written before 70 AD, before the destruction of the temple. So even the gospel writers here are writing prophecy, all right? And if we look at it, so I want to talk about the dating of the Gospels. And in particular, most scholars, biblical scholars, not non-biblical scholars, but most biblical scholars date the Gospels between 50 and the mid-60s AD, well before the destruction of the temple. And in particular, I want to talk about Luke, because Luke is probably the easiest to pinpoint. Interestingly, Mark is the first gospel written, or at least most scholars believe that. And there's a couple reasons for that. It's the shortest gospel, and it's probably the worst grammatical book. Like, Mark's not very good with grammar. So if you're going to copy Mark or use Mark as a reference, you're probably going to fix the grammar, right? And you're going to add to a story. So again, Mark kind of comes first. So if we think about dating Luke, and we can date Luke, well, then we can date Mark prior to that. And Luke and Matthew are very much, there's a lot of similarities between them, so they're almost like siblings, which means if you date Luke, you can kind of date Matthew as right around that same time as well. So how do we date Luke? And it's really pretty easy. Did you realize that Luke actually writes 2 books? He writes Luke, and he writes the book of Acts. And in Acts, he tells us that he had just written Luke. So if we can date Acts, we can date Luke. And Acts, interestingly enough, ends very abruptly. It ends with Paul under house arrest and prior to his death. So Luke ends with Paul under house arrest prior to his death under Nero. So it reasons to believe that Acts had to have been finished prior to Nero's killing Paul, which would be late 60s. So we can kind of see that Acts was probably written in the mid-60s. Does that make sense? Which then means that Luke was written when? Prior to probably early 60s, right? So the Gospels were written prior to 70 AD, prior to the destruction of the temple. So the Gospels were written prophesying about this event, right? So now let's get back to Luke 21. And we see that the disciples come to Jesus after they had left Jerusalem. They had retreated for the night. And they come to him and they ask him this: when will these things happen? Again, the destruction of the temple. When are these things going to happen? And what will be the sign that they are about to take place? Mark records it this way in 13:4. He says, "Tell us, when will this be, and what will be the sign of these things, that these things are all to be accomplished?" Matthew, the Jew, goes a little different. He says it this way in Matthew 24:3. "Tell us, when will this be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the close of the age?" You see what Matthew did there? He added a couple events that the other two authors didn't talk about at all. The sign of your coming and the close of the age. So that brings us to an issue with the Gospels, and that's that in ancient times, you could quote somebody and still not be accurate. Like, as long as you got kind of the gist of it. Like, these three guys are all quoting Jesus. They're all in red. And none of these quotes match. That's acceptable in the ancient world. But Matthew adds this whole other thing. And I got thinking about it, like, why would Matthew goes further. And I think the key to that is that Matthew, being a Jew, I think too part of it, like Matthew, he's writing after Jesus' death, right? So for Mark and for Luke, they maybe are faithful to what Jesus originally said, maybe. I don't know. I can't say. But Matthew now is looking back at it after the crucifixion, and he's like, okay, the topic was bigger than just the temple, right? And if we read the second half of Luke 21 or Matthew 24, you're going to see that there is prophecy about the second coming, right? So I think Luke kind of maybe Matthew kind of changes it maybe to accommodate for the fact that Jesus actually talks about more than just the destruction of the temple here. I don't know. It's just my personal speculation. But clearly the first part of Jesus' discussion here, it describes a war with Rome and the events that lead up to that. You guys kind of with me so far? Hopefully. I don't know, I kind of can be weird sometimes. But
sometimes, all times.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that clarification, Beth. But so the question is, what events are there that lead us to the destruction of the temple? Remember, the temple is destroyed in 70 AD. Jesus goes on to describe a whole lot of stuff that happens prior to 70 AD. And he does that here. So in Luke 21, verses 8 through 19, he goes on, he says, he replied. So again, he's replying to the disciples asking about the destruction of the temple. And he says, "Watch out that you are not deceived, for many will come in my name, claiming I am he, and the time is near. Do not follow them. When you hear of wars and uprisings, do not be frightened. These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away. Then he will say to them, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, famine, pestilence in various places, and fearful events and great signs from heaven." All of this stuff happens before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. That's what Jesus is saying, right? But before all this stuff happens, they will seize you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and put you in prison, and you will be brought before kings and governors and all on account of my name. So he's talking specifically to the disciples here, right? The people that asked him about this event, he's literally telling them what their fate is. But make up your mind not to worry beforehand how you will defend yourselves. For I will give you words and wisdom that none of your adversaries will be able to resist or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents, brothers and sisters, relatives and friends, and they'll put some of you to death. Everyone will hate you because of me, but not a hair on your head will perish. Stand firm, and you will win life. So Jesus is describing all of the things that are happening prior to the destruction of the temple, and he says, but don't even worry about that because you guys ain't going to make it that far. Right? Like how many of you are like, hey, sign me up? Right? Like, it's amazing any of them stuck around, right? And all three Gospels basically record this way. It's interesting because Matthew actually uses a little different terminology here in 24:9, talking about the same event. He says, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. The Greek word here is thlipsis, and it can be defined as tribulation, oppression, affliction, or trouble that inflicts distress. I just pointing that out because there's certain end times people that tribulation is tribulation's kind of a special word and it has a special meaning, like it means a specific time in the end times. And Matthew's using it here to describe what's happening to the disciples prior to 70 AD. Anyway, just one of the things, and so here's one of the things with biblical translators, a lot of times when they come across a term that has some sort of like theological ambiguity, or like if we try and translate this term, it's going to cause problems because everybody has different theology around it. They tend to just transliterate it, thlipsis. So basically what happens is this term tribulation gets translated as tribulation because nobody translating a Bible wants to make a theological position out of it because so many other people's theological positions are going to differ. Another word we do that with is baptize. The Greek word's baptizo. And some people think it's sprinkling on as a kid. Some people think you have to go to the river. There's so much theological stuff packed into that word that rather than try and articulate our belief in it, we just transliterate it, and let everybody that basically define it however you want. And so that's what happens here with this word tribulation, is it's left kind of ambiguous so that different theological groups can translate it differently, right? Anyway, moving on, because we're not going to be here all day. We might, but so back to the disciples, right? So Jesus just laid out this really fun time they're going to have in the future, right? Prior to the destruction of the temple. And that it's going to be, so the next things that happen are going to happen to the disciples, and they're going to face a lot of hardships: persecution, prison, betrayal, even death, right? Doesn't sound like a good time. So here's what happens to the 12 disciples. So I just studied what happens to these guys. Peter is crucified upside down in Rome in 67 or 68 AD. Paul is killed in Rome around the same time. Andrew, he's crucified on an X-shaped cross in Greece in 60. James, the son of Zebedee, he's executed by Herod in 44 AD. John, the writer of the book of Revelation, he dies of natural causes in Ephesus, the only one not to be martyred. Philip is crucified in Hierapolis. Bartholomew is flayed alive in Armenia. Matthew is killed by the sword in Ethiopia. Thomas, the guy that doubted Jesus, the guy, if of any, would bail at this point, he's stabbed with a spear in India. That one chokes me up. I mean, the guy that doubted Jesus was willing to die for him. Think about that. Who dies for a lie? Nobody. Thaddeus was killed by arrows in Persia. Simon the Zealot was martyred in Persia. Judas, he hung himself. Right? Man, that's a tough act to follow, but anyway, so these are all the things that happen prior to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So finally we get to my verse 20, and Luke says this: "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near." You see, if you look at the context of Luke 21, this isn't a verse about a future event, is it? This is simply a verse about the coming war with Rome. And Jesus is describing all of the things that are going to happen to get us to that place in time. This isn't a far-off prophetic event, but rather it's something that the disciples themselves were asking about, that there's this impending showdown with Rome, right? And then Luke goes on to describe the scene after the fall of Jerusalem. He says, Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. For this is the time of punishment and fulfillment of all that has been written. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against his people. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. So right there, Luke's describing the aftermath, the Roman occupation and destruction of Jerusalem. That the people of Judea will be killed, yet others will be driven from their homes, from their way of life, and scattered throughout the Roman Empire. This event, the fancy theological term, just so you guys know it, it's called the diaspora. All right? And the Jewish people, to this day, are still scattered throughout the world. However, in 1948, the nation of Israel was reborn, and a lot of Jews went back to that nation. But hopefully you guys can see that when we read something in context, it maybe means something different, right? That this Facebook post that I saw saying that what we're seeing today in Jerusalem is a sign of the end times. If you actually look at the context, that happened 2,000 years ago, right? I'm not saying that there isn't a prophetic future, right? Like, I'm not saying that things can't happen again in the future. I'm just simply saying that when we read things in context, we get a more clear picture. And I think that I just wanted to encourage you guys, like, not everything you see on Facebook's true. Right? Right? Yes. So to kind of wrap this up, what I'm trying to say is that while I believe anything is possible, right, that there are that the Bible talks about the future. And in fact, if you read on in Luke 21, he's going to talk about the second coming. He will. It's just that these things are not it. But some interesting tidbits. In order for the destruction of the temple to happen, Israel would have to build one. So, again, the implication in this Facebook post is that Jesus is like on his way, right? Like he's, I don't know, warming up the band, getting dressed, I don't know what. But like they give us this sense of urgency. And the reality is there's no temple to even desecrate, right? These things can't be fulfilled until a whole bunch of other things happen that could take forever. I mean, we may not see it in our lifetime, right? But I think it's pretty clear that these events did happen in the first century, right? And that Daniel's prophecies, and I didn't even have time to get into Daniel's prophecies, but Daniel's prophecies were actually fulfilled by the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. They actually were fulfilled again before that in 167 AD under a Seleucid king named Antiochus Epiphanes IV, but that's a whole other sermon. Right? But what I want you guys to understand is this. I wholeheartedly believe, and I'm awaiting for the return of Christ. I am. It could happen at any time. It could happen right now. We don't know. And that's why Jesus says it's going to come like a thief in the night. But today I want to encourage us to live our life in such a way that he could return at any moment. We need to live a life expectant that Jesus is coming back and not to be caught off guard. But I also want us to live a life where we're not looking at every single news article, every single world event, and trying to piece it into the book of Revelation somehow, into some sort of scheme. But rather, we need to be looking at those around us, our friends, our neighbors, and our coworkers as Jesus did, right? To fulfill the Great Commission. Rather than constantly trying to, I read that, never mind. Let's tell them about Jesus, his death, burial, and resurrection. And I'm going to conclude by leaving you with this amazing quote, and I don't know who the author is, but this quote is absolutely amazing. He says, "How can you talk to your neighbor about the second coming when you haven't told him about the first?" So hopefully I cleared up a little bit about this particular verse. Again, I should probably not read Facebook, but because I tend to get into some arguments that, probably aren't healthy. But you guys, we can't predict the future. We don't even know what it's going to look like. That's why he says it's going to come as a thief in the night. All we can do is live ready for it, but live in a way that's healthy, where we're not like in an unhealthy relationship with maybe the book of Revelation. And what that means to me is the Great Commission. Really, we need to be living the Great Commission. So hopefully that was good. I don't know, it's kind of random, but anyway, thank you guys. Andrew will be back next week.